So the main section of the book that I focused on today was like the feminism aspect of it, and especially feminism in social work. So feminism itself, kind of a broad overview, it really focuses on gender inequality, and when you add in the social work piece, it focuses on like how gender inequality shapes people's lives, experiences, opportunities, access to resources, those kinds of things. Well, feminism itself is often associated with advocating for women's rights. In social work, it has more of a broad meaning. It involves a lot more challenging of the systems that oppress a lot of individuals based off of gender, identity, and even like class and power.
Yeah.
So, social work and feminism are really deeply connected because they both emphasize social justice, human rights, the importance of individuals and dignity, and overall just a lot of those NASW core values, and address inequality in their own.
Hmm.
So, examining feminism within social work really helps us to get a better understanding of how professionals can work to empower individuals while also addressing those like systemic barriers that impact entire communities in a
Okay.
very similar way to our environmental projects that we've been doing, but in this case, it's just more of a feminism kind of area. So, feminism itself is a very social political movement that is aimed at achieving gender equality, as I kind of said, and also as we know just from living life experiences. It really challenges systems like the patriarchy, which historically like privilege men and especially white men, while marginalizing women and other gender identities. And there are a lot of different perspectives within feminism that all kind of offer different lenses. I was doing a little research on them just to go deeper than the book that we had read about. And some of them, like there's a liberal feminism versus a radical feminism and different things like that. So, just a little bit, because I don't know how much you know, liberal feminism really focuses on achieving equal rights and opportunities through laws and policies.
Hmm.
Whereas radical feminism really focuses on dismantling systems of patriarchy altogether and really rebuilding those systems from the ground up at a more even like playing field kind of thing. Intersectional feminism, which in my mind is kind of a combination of both, hence the intersectional, but that really emphasizes that people experience oppression differently depending on different aspects of them. So their race, their class, their gender identity, their sexual orientation. So for example, a black gay woman will experience feminism and the kind of oppression that goes with that a lot differently than a white upper class woman. And
Yeah.
they're both experiencing feminism, but in two vastly different ways. And so that's another thing to keep in mind from a social work mindset as well, is that all of these different things, feminism, environmental injustice, anything of those things, they're all being experienced very differently, even though they are, I don't want to say a blanket term, but they are all being experienced by people, but they're being experienced very differently.
Yes.
So that really emphasizes like social work's emphasis on understanding like the whole person and person and environment versus just the environment itself.
Hmm.
So a little bit of like history on feminism, just as I was researching it, I just wanted to dig a little deeper. As we kind of have learned in other classes, Jane Addams, one of like the first kind of social workers, played a major role in advocating for women's rights. She focused a lot on improving living conditions and addressing poverty. She was part of the settlement house movement, which focused on supporting marginalized communities. And those marginalized communities at the time were women and children, and especially living in urban poverty. And then during like the 1960s, 1970s, the second wave of feminism really influence social work by bringing attention to the issues of like domestic violence and reproductive rights and workplace inequality. And it really started going from just men versus women to these are problems that women are experiencing that men never even have to think about.
Hmm.
Or in the case of like domestic violence, they have to think about it, but it's not as common as like men being the aggressors towards women. Not saying that it doesn't happen the other way around, but it's not as commonly thought about. That period of like the 1960s, 1970s also really led to the development of like more feminist-based therapies, which is really
Mhm.
interesting to me. I'd never really thought about that. But those really emphasize the equality between the client and the practitioner and not, there was still a power dynamic because there always will be, but there was much less of a power dynamic, especially between, say, a white male therapist and a black female client. And it really started to work on trying to mitigate those differences in whatever way possible.
Yeah.
So that is also really important to understand in some of that like social context of social workers really social work as a whole being shaped by some of these feminist movements and by feminism in general as being something that advocates for that systemic change, just like Jane Addams did.
Yeah.
Um, Kind of going back to the NASW core principles, it's feminist social work is guided by the same principles in like theory and in practice. Um, Especially some of the ones like empowerment and equality and also some other ones along the way that kind of fit into those, but wouldn't necessarily be the exact words as the principles. So one of the ones that I mentioned was empowerment, which I mean, it focuses on helping people gain power and control in their lives and help them to make these informed decisions. And one of the examples of that in feminism, like in general or specifically, it was really helping women to understand that they were not less than and that they actually deserved a seat at the table where the men were.
Yes.
And that really has started becoming more popular in, I would say, the last like 50, 40-ish years.
Mhm.
It's been steadily growing, but I think even within the last 30 or so years, and even in the last few years in general, it has really grown and become a much more obvious thing. I mean, even just the other day, we had a woman in space, and really that mission, went farther than we had ever gone before. But just the fact that a woman was able to be there, it really shows a lot compared to 100 years ago when no one would have ever dreamed of putting a woman in space.
Yes.
Um, Another one of those like principles is the equality piece, which really involves challenging those power imbalances, which can happen in therapy settings and clinical settings, but it can also happen in communities and institutions and things like that. Social workers, I mean, obviously we see these every day now as people with internships and jobs and just walking by in the community. But being able to see those and call them out and show that these things should not be the way they are and that they deserve change is a really important part of social work as well. And then one of the other ones that it makes total sense, but I would not have personally worded in the way that I saw in the research was consciousness raising, which for me is just a hard word to say to begin with.
Mhm.
But it really was talking about encouraging individuals to recognize how social structures and inequalities affect their experiences, which makes total sense, just not something that I had ever thought about putting those words in that order.
Yes.
Um, but I did find that really interesting, and so that's why I wanted to make sure that I included it in here and also that I wrote it down so I didn't know how to, so I didn't say it wrong. But another one is collaboration, which is obviously emphasizing the partnerships between social workers and clients, but also emphasizing the relationship between different individuals and in situations that women may not feel like they belong at the table, convincing them that they do. And I think another one of those like kind of aspects of it is that it really should say it. Social work really helps promote social change and address like the root cause of the inequality rather than only treating the individual symptoms. So I know I mentioned that before, but kind of to give an example, like uh, this wouldn't, I shouldn't say it wouldn't happen today. Let's say it hopefully would not happen today. But if an individual, if a girl at a school feels like she's not getting the same opportunities as the boys are, say in like her debate team, if she were to go to a school social worker or something like that, hopefully she could go to anyone and they'd help with this, but you never know. Um, but she could go to them and say, "Hey, I don't feel like I'm getting an equal place in this because of my gender." To really go through and explain to her that, hey, you do deserve to be there. Let's see what we can do to help, instead of you're a girl, suck it up, move on. Um, Focusing more on like the practice aspect of social work, it really takes a different role when it comes to like a feminist side of it. And it's not as much so like a traditional model because it recognizes that like personal struggles are influenced so much by the broader social, political, structural factors rather than necessarily a single thing that's on the individual level. So, for example, like typically a person who experiencing financial hardship, it probably has to do with wage inequality or discrimination and things like that. And so typically social workers would focus on, okay, what can we do to get you more money? Can we sign you up for these benefits? Can we get you food stamps? Those kinds of things to help fix the immediate need. And that is still amazing because people need to eat, people need money to keep a roof over their heads. But the feminist social work kind of perspective focuses more on avoiding placing blame on the individuals and instead focusing on understanding the larger context. So they, like most social workers, prioritize client voice and lived experience, making sure that like people feel seen and heard. But they also will then try and challenge the power dynamics and figure out where in the system there's the flaw that's causing these people to be underserved and undervalued. Because typically it's never a person's fault what gender they are. That is not something that they decided to be because they wanted to be a problem child. That's not a thing. And so really to focus in these experiences on, okay, where is the problem in the system? Because there is one. It's really to me an empowering thought going into social work, even though I don't necessarily think I'll be in a category that would have to do with feminism. I mean, it exists every day, but it's not an area I would specifically go into. It's still a really interesting aspect to think about going into everything else. Sorry, that's my little soapbox moment here. But just going back to the lived experiences in practicing like feminist-based social work, it does challenge those power dynamics, like I said, but it also can be very beneficial in certain areas that typically do happen to be more women focused, but it does not always have to be that way. But the feminist approaches are really used a lot in supporting survivors of domestic violence, addressing discrimination in the gender pay gap, and institutions like schools and healthcare systems, and individuals not necessarily being treated as well because of the gender that they are. So, for example, I'm sure you've experienced this. I've experienced this many times. Going to the doctor and being told, oh, it's your anxiety when you have a medical problem. And it is not your anxiety. And I have had that happen
Mhm.
so many times.
All in your
Or
head, right?
being, uh-huh, yeah, it's super fun. And not every time, but a lot of times it is male doctors telling me that.
Mhm.
And you want to look at them and say, I know my body better than you do. But they
Mhm.
have their fancy little their little medical degrees, so they don't think they do. Not to bash on doctors, it's very much so institutionalized in the system at this point, unfortunately. But it is something that needs to be changed. And so that is a large area where people can work to advocate for that to not happen because it's very disheartening. It's very upsetting. And also, it can sometimes cause people not to want to go back to the doctor. And then that ends
Mhm.
up causing more harm than good. And it can just be a very slippery slope.
Yeah.
Um, Kind of in relation to that, but like issues based on gender or like gender-based issues that are also related to gender inequality can also include unequal access to healthcare, like we just talked about, but also the wage gap. So going along with that, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but something I've heard of before is like the pink tax. And it's how things are often more expensive for if they're advertised for girls than they are for boys. So the example I'm thinking of right now is Nerf guns. They make like a pink unicorn Nerf gun, and then they make the
Yes.
regular Nerf guns. And the pink unicorn Nerf gun is like $5 more expensive, but it's the exact same thing, just pink
Yes.
and with a unicorn on it. And I mean, that's not the worst example in the world because it's a Nerf gun at the end of the day, but just the
Mhm.
concept of it. we shouldn't have to have this issue of looking at the price and it being $5 more expensive because it's for girls or
Yes.
for women. And so that goes along with that gender pay gap. But at the same time, as a social worker, you want to look at that and you don't even have to wonder of why are they poor, why are they struggling with money, because everything they're making less and paying more.
Hmm.
And so really looking at that aspect and looking at it in a lens of how do we fix this? What can we do if policy isn't changing? How do we support these individuals in a way that will still help them without obviously getting ourselves in trouble, but also without making them feel less than simply because of their gender? I think a big key of helping that happen is the idea of intersectionality, and really highlighting like the complexity and the difficulties that people are experiencing in these situations. Um, Someone named Kimberly Crenshaw said that intersectionality refers to the way different forms of oppression overlap and interact. And so, an example of that would be a person experiencing discrimination based on gender, and then also based off of race, class, or sexual orientation, like I mentioned before. So, this does really focus on the idea that no two people experience the same gender inequality. They nobody experiences the same things because everyone has a slightly different story. And so this really does encourage social workers to focus on each individual person while still paying attention to the bigger picture. Because if we try and fix the bigger picture or at least do something to address it, it will help everyone else in the long run. So I gave a lot of good things about feminism and social work, but there were also a lot of articles that were critiquing it very harshly. A lot of those reasons had to do with more of the early feminist movements, which were often done mainly by white middle class women, middle and upper class women. And so, while it was still a great idea, it excluded a lot of marginalized groups. And so the idea was there completely, but there was a racist aspect to it. And I don't know, we have no idea if that was purposeful or not. Unfortunately, it probably somewhat was. But we can't ignore that part of it, and we still have to address that in a way.
Mhm.
And so just taking note of that, and it is a little bit better now, it seems, but still, there are always those racist tendencies and those racist individuals out there who may not even seem like they're doing it, but they might subconsciously be doing something and excluding different groups who do deserve to be at the table.
Mhm.
Um, Also, social workers often have to work within institutions, whether that be CYS or a school or a healthcare system. And sometimes those areas, they have certain rules on what you are and are not allowed to do. So, same with what you are and are not allowed to advocate for. So, for
Mhm.
the example of even a social worker who is being paid less because they are a woman and their coworker is a male, they might not even be able to advocate for themselves to get equal pay because of where they work. And then that makes it even harder for them to advocate for other people to get equal pay.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so there are still a lot of systemic barriers in place, no matter what people do, that until those very big issues are changed, we're not going to have as much change as we would like to. So, kind of to sum that up, because I know that was a lot, but feminism is still really relevant in social work, like we read about in the book, like I saw in a bunch of different articles, because gender inequality still exists, and it exists in like the pay gap, reproductive rights, or a lack of control over your reproductive rights, gender identity, access to healthcare, all of those things are still very large concerns. You see it in the news
Mhm.
every single day. You see it when midterms come up, when elections come up, all of that. Social workers definitely see and serve diverse populations with complex needs, and that makes like the feminist framework even more important because not only are people experiencing gender gaps, but they're also experiencing race and class and all of these different things, gaps in those as well, which is just making the problem even more important and even more significant to them. So feminism really plays like a crucial role in shaping social work into the profession that it is, and it being grounded in social justice and equality and all of the core values. It helps to provide a framework for understanding how these inequalities help individuals and affect individuals, while also offering strategies for empowerment and advocacy and promoting the human rights of everyone.
Mhm. Yes.
So from there, going into some questions. So just either thinking about your own personal life or your internship or GA or whatever you want to think about when you answer this. But in what way do you think feminist principles change the way that social workers practice in settings like schools or healthcare or policy making that are more like restricted?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, a lot of excellent information. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
As far as like the perspective of feminist social work, it kind of reminds me a little bit of like anti-racist social work,
Hmm.
because you are thinking of everything from a different lens and from a different perspective other than your stereotypical white male perspective.
Definitely.
So, but your question is, how does it restrict?
Yeah, so like how would it be different? How would like how would it be different in these settings that are more restrictive?
Okay. Um, hmm. So I guess like in my GA, for example, so I'm the graduate assistant for multicultural student affairs. Um, and we deal with basically any diverse population, and have several organizations that help to lead groups on campus for that. We don't have any specific that are feminist based, but we do have the Free to Be Me program, which is LGBTQ plus oriented, similar to the Pride program, not the Pride program, the Page Center. Um, but if we were to utilize a feminist social work perspective in that realm of the Free to Be Me program, it would probably help to recruit more individuals, you know, um, just because of the inclusivity and
Hmm.
the aspects related to different perspectives shifts other than, like I said earlier, the stereotypical white male perspective. We would be able to probably approach different policies and procedures on campus, such as like Title IX policies and procedures that would be more beneficial to everybody included, not just, you know, the majority. So, yeah.
Definitely. And I think the fact that you have so many different populations of people who come to that, I don't want to say for service, but for community and for all different types of things.
Hmm.
But the fact there are so many really helps strengthen it, I think, because
Yes.
people see the power in numbers, even if the people don't look like them or don't act like them or don't have the same beliefs as them, because you're still part of MSA and you're still
Yes.
included and you're still part of like the family.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
having been on at Ship for undergrad, it is a family at MSA. Like that is a family.
it
No
is.
matter what, like if you're blue, if you're green, if you have like 18 eyes, like you're all the same MSA
I
family. I don't know why that was the example I thought of, but it was.
love it
Um,
though.
but yeah, I think definitely.
Yes.
I think kind of to challenge you a little bit with this one, in what ways can social work become more inclusive of diverse identities?
Um, well, we were kind of talking about me and a peer were talking about this a little bit earlier today in regard to how people of the same race, culture, and ethnicity will still see things very differently. So the example given was like this individual, he identifies as black, but there are other individuals from the same race, culture, and ethnicity that identify as African American, you
Hmm.
know? And so it's just honestly recognizing that regardless of your similarities, that there are still so many differences between close-knitted communities, you know?
Definitely. Yeah.
So
I
I
think
feel, go ahead.
I think that made me think of something else. Like, but I had a conversation once, and it was one of those, okay, everyone sit down, we're having a hard conversation moments. And it
Okay.
was a lot of people of different races, genders, and ethnicities. And we were talking about the ways that people who are from minority skin colors and ethnicities and things like that, how they like to be addressed.
Hmm.
And specifically the question of where are you from?
Yeah.
Because I could ask someone, where are you from? And legitimately mean, like, where in Pennsylvania are you from before college?
Yeah.
But they are, I don't want to say programmed, but they've had the question so many times, they expect me to be asking, where in South America are you from? Or where in Africa are you from? And
Yes.
that isn't necessarily what someone means, but the fact that it's just how they live, that's their life. And so for us to even have that thought of, oh, I accidentally offended them when I
Mhm.
legitimately wanted to know where in Pennsylvania they grew up.
Yes. Well, and the same can be true with a white individual, but in the reverse context. So like,
Hmm.
because we're so used to being like, where are you from? Because you're a hick or you're a hillbilly or whatever, whatever,
Yes.
and it's
Yeah.
like instead of saying like, oh, I'm from Europe or I'm from, Germany or Canada or wherever, we don't even think about that. We think like,
Hmm.
oh, I'm from Hicksville or like literally there's a road near where I live called Hicksville. So I'm not trying to say that
Oh
condescendingly.
no.
I'm just saying
Lovely. Lovely. Hmm.
but like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm from Clear Spring, or oh no, I'm actually from Baltimore, like I'm
Yeah.
actually from both of those places. One is inner city, and the other one is
Hmm.
like I was surrounded on three sides by cornfields, and we would go
Yeah.
cow tipping for fun.
Yeah. Hmm.
So it's very similar, but in the reverse context.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting because the reverse is not something we often think of, but it exists
Mhm.
still, and you see it every day. We don't think about it because we're just so used to our own little way of life.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So then, probably last question I have here.
Hmm.
How do you think social workers, given what we talked about, can effectively balance supporting the individual client, but also address the larger systemic issues like gender inequality or even racial inequality?
Oh, that's a tough one, to be honest. I feel like if we had the real answer for that, things would be so different today.
Yes.
But I
Yes.
think it starts with what you mentioned earlier about being able to advocate for yourself.
Hmm.
Like if you are female and you're unable to advocate for fair pay, how do you expect to appropriately advocate for fair pay for one of your clients? You
Yeah.
know? So being able to stand up for what you believe in is right for you and your, close-knitted family or community is, I think, the first step in being able to expand your horizons and expand your ability to outreach to even more individuals. So,
Definitely. And I think going off of that, the ability to know when you need to ask for help and to admit that you need to ask for help. Because
yes.
a lot of times in that like therapist client, social worker client situation, you are seen as like the all-knowing deity, basically. And so to admit the fact that, hey, I've had the same problem and I had to ask my supervisor for help, or I asked someone for help. To admit that you've asked for help too, not only does it show that you're human and
Hmm.
kind of helps with that power dynamic, but it also shows that it's hard. It's hard either way. And
Hmm.
so we can all do it together versus you're on your own and isolated in this.
And that there's no shame in asking for help, and there's no pride in doing it on your own.
Definitely. And I think that all even relates back to that idea of how do you work for a single person and in the broader picture? Because
Yeah.
if you're proving that, look, we can work together to do this, you don't have to do it alone, it shows that there even is that broader group of people out there who that individual might not even known about because they're so caught up in their own experience.
Yes. Yeah, I agree 100%.
Yeah, I think it's
So,
just very interesting to think about how isolated people might feel and that we don't even realize they feel that. And so then to be able to help them navigate and realize that these different groups exist is really awesome.
yes.
Yeah. Okay, that is it. That's all I've got.
Okay, very good. Excellent questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so I typically just go through chapter by chapter and then kind of analyze each chapter and provide questions along the way. So we'll start with chapter one, the Imagine a Country. This one I found so intriguing personally. I actually sent it the entire chapter to my family and was like, "You guys got to read this."
I love it.
Um, but there were several key points that really stuck out to me. The first was imagine a country where healthcare aides can't afford to take sick days, where farm workers and security guards turn to overwhelmed food banks to help their families, and homelessness is rising among working families. That to me is one of the most contradictory statements from that whole chapter. I mean, the whole thing was contradictory, but that to me was very contradictory because it's literally the backbone of America is relying on the backbone of America, you know? So it was pretty intense, in my opinion. Um, Out of nearly 800 occupations surveyed by the Labor Department, only 20 have lower median hourly wages than childcare workers. So we put so much emphasis on children and how children are our future, and we put so much emphasis on the need for effective and healthy and responsible childcare workers. You know, like you have to pass so many background checks and you have to have degrees and all this stuff to be a childcare worker, yet they're getting paid next to nothing. And that pissed me off. Um, in 1980, one in every 453 residents was incarcerated. In 2010, the figure was one in over 100, or one in every 137, one in every 44 people, including children, are under some form of correctional control. That is staggering in my opinion. I mean, I don't know what your graduating class was. Mine was 117. So looking at those numbers, that goes to show that at least three or four of those people are under some kind of correctional control. And that just doesn't make sense to me because I come from a very small town and it's like, oh, that shouldn't happen, you know? So my question for this chapter was how this is I have a couple questions, but the first one is like how is a country that is so noted to be one of the greatest in the world this distorted, this troublesome, this disturbing, you know, for a magnitude of reasons. And I know that that's not really a question we can answer. That's more of a rhetorical question,
Yeah.
but it's something to ponder for sure. Um, Additionally, I wondered when it was talking about both the highs and the lows throughout that chapter, who was the political party or the president during those highs and lows? You know, and like I'd be really interested to see the statistics behind that, the political statistics behind that. So, all right. Moving on to number two. Not all my questions are rhetorical, just so you're aware.
Hey.
Moving on to chapter two, the question of class. So again, I'll point out some things that stood out to me and then I'll ask you some questions. So the first is what I know for sure is that class, gender, sexual preference, and prejudice, racial, ethnic, and religious, form an intricate lattice that restricts and shapes our lives. And that resistance to hatred is not a simple act. I loved that quote. It really does form this woven tapestry, you know? Um, and unfortunately, all of these things shape everybody's lives, even if you are, you know, the most privileged of the privileged. These aspects shape our lives. I think about it too in an almost an anti-racial lens to the point of like we as a society are so driven to make sure that we are hiring diverse populations and minority populations and all that stuff that unfortunately for a white male, it's becoming harder and harder for them to, you know, gain employment in a field that they are more than qualified for. So there's just no perfect balance, I've noticed.
Yeah.
So it was interesting. And then, like so many women of my generation, I believed absolutely that I could make a difference with my life, and I was willing to give my life for the chance to make that difference. I felt like if more social workers were from this standpoint,
Hmm.
we would have more action and more progress, you
Yeah,
know? And I get that that's kind of a drastic thing to ask for, but I do feel like, unfortunately, so many of us as social workers tend to be more talk than action and more passive than active, you know? So,
definitely.
um, so my question is, how does intersectionality form an activist? And you talked about intersectionality in your
Mhm.
presentation. So how does that form an activist?
I think, okay, so my internship is actually in a law clinic, and it's an interdisciplinary law and social work clinic. So I love this question. But I think intersectionality really brings different areas into a person's understanding. So, for the example of me, I went into this internship knowing nothing about the law and not knowing the rights and things that people were literally given by law.
Mhm.
And so now, if I see, say, a child, well, we work mostly with children, just for that reference here. But if I see a child who has been in foster care for 20 months, like there is actually a law that says if a child is in foster care for 15 of the last 22 months, they must change from the goal being to go back to parents to the goal being something else, to no longer being reunification. And so the ability to have intersectional knowledge, in this case for law, but for other things as well, maybe looking at gender and then looking at race and having both of those lenses. It gives people multiple lenses to look at something through, which can kind of help give different answers to problems. But it also just helps a person be more well-rounded, I think, in my opinion, and just be better at their job in general.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a fantastic answer. I agree. Especially the aspect of just being more well-rounded. You know,
Hmm.
that's one of the reasons that I chose to focus on social work for grad school is because I had psychology, sociology, and addictions counseling under my belt. But what I was practicing was purely addictions counseling. And I
Hmm.
was like, I need to expand my horizons and, gain some trauma-focused treatment and, mental health and all that, and just be a little bit more well-rounded so that I can actually make more of a difference.
Yeah,
So yeah.
definitely.
Very good. Thank you. All right. Moving on to chapter 3, why America's schools have a money problem. So this it gave two examples of two different schools. Hold on, my pen is metallic, so it's like shining.
Oh, no.
Um, so I think the school's name was Randout and Ridge. So Randout had so much money and Ridge had so little money, yet they were in the same community. Um, and that honestly brought back or brought up the idea of the environmental discrimination that we've been talking about all
Hmm.
semester. They're in the same community, yet because they're on different sides of the fence,
Yeah.
they get very different aspects of the financial support. Um, so there's a quote in there that says, "You've got highly segregated rich and poor towns." Bruce Baker of Rutgers University. And nearly 1 in 5 Arizona districts now uses the 4-day school week. So this to me, they were using a 4-day school week because they couldn't pay the teachers for a 5-day school week, and they couldn't turn the electricity on for that fifth day. So again, rand out. I don't know if that's an A or no, but that school in particularly had so little as opposed to Ridge, who had like an indoor swimming pool and these amazing soccer fields and athletic fields and all that stuff. Um, one of the quotes that I found to be really, really intense was kids can't check their poverty at the classroom door.
Hmm.
And I love that quote because it's so eye-opening in my opinion. It's very much like kids can't really check trauma at the classroom
Yeah.
door. And unfortunately, poverty is a form of trauma. It's on, the adverse childhood
Yeah.
experience questionnaire. Um, so yeah. So I have a couple questions here for this one. leading into it, so I looked up the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, which basically prevents states from denying equal education opportunities. And this was established by Brown versus Board of Ed. Um, the Title VI Civil Rights Act of 1964 also prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin in programs receiving federal funding. So, the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights ensures equal access to high quality education. And so my question here is, how have equal rights to education, acts, titles, clauses, etc., enabled or allowed the unequal distribution of funding among school systems purely from different socioeconomic backgrounds and communities?
I think I might miss a portion of that question, so redirect me if needed.
That's
But I
okay.
think partially, I mean, the first thing I could think of here was this is like random, but I don't know if you've ever seen Hidden Figures or read Hidden Figures.
Yes.
It made me think of that at first
Mhm.
because yes, all of these things by law are they're supposed to be equal, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are
Mhm.
or that they might be being funded equally, but a school, if both schools get $5,000, there's one school that has PTO parents who are sending checks for $500 every other day because they can, and a
Mhm.
school who's $25,000 in debt and can barely keep the lights on.
Mhm.
$5,000 is going to help both of them, but in very different ways. One can
Yeah.
buy a fountain just to sit in the middle of the school for fun, and one is now still $20,000 in debt and still struggling to keep the lights on.
Yes.
And so while these laws and acts are important and they have good intentions, it doesn't necessarily fix the problem.
Yes. I think you're absolutely onto something, especially considering like donations made by community members, you know. I think that equality it kind of brings up I think it's the box scenario.
Yes, that's
So
what I was
like
just thinking of.
equality versus hold on a second. Equality versus equity
Uh-huh.
versus taking down the systemic barrier.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
know, so like we could distribute $10,000 equally among the schools and give 5,000 to each school, or we could be like, okay, well, this school needs more, so we'll give 7,000 to this one and only 3,000 to that one. Or we could be like, okay, this school doesn't need nearly as much, so let's allocate the rest of the funds to the school that needs it the most to make the schools equal.
Yes.
Yeah,
Definitely.
absolutely. I felt like, if it was a measure, I said, it's as if this measure is the one thing forgotten and the equal funding has invariably found a way around this flaw and loophole. And I do think that that unfortunately is mostly because of the additional income that we see from other locations. So, all right, chapter 4. How can we close our racial wealth gap? So, white Americans are more likely to receive inheritances or other monetary gifts from family. Black households headed by a college grad have lower net worth than white households headed by someone who didn't even finish high school. That was pretty staggering.
Yeah.
And there's a difference between banning something and stopping it. This, that again, really stood out to me. Um, so hold on a second, I got a lot here. Um, okay, so on page 830, paragraph 4, there were multiple studies regarding people's perspectives on naming certain monuments or certain locations after Black individuals.
Yes.
And I think that that was really interesting because we literally just talked about something similar in class about how the Florida airport is being
Yep.
renamed after President Trump.
hmm
And I honestly was going to kind of do like a mini test on my mom and be like, because so my mom unfortunately doesn't have the greatest viewpoints, and she threw a big fit when BWI Airport was renamed Thurgood Marshall Airport. And
hmm
I don't even know if she knows that Thurgood Marshall is like a justice, like a judge,
hmm
and like he has done a lot of really awesome things. But she knew that it was somebody African American, and she threw a fit about it, right?
hmm
So I was going to basically just kind of throw out some random names and be like, yeah, this location is named after this person now, and give her a white name, and then do the
hmm
same exact thing with a black name, regardless of whether that person exists or not, right?
Yeah.
But I really wanted to test the theory and see what her reaction would be to that.
hmm
Um, So let me see. Um, I wanted to see how she would respond in that in particularly. Just because again, like it implicates the racial gap, the specifically the racial wealth gap because of my mom's reactions. So anyway, I digress. Additionally, there was the baby bonds. So this was a really cool idea that was thrown in there into that chapter. So somebody proposed the idea of every time a baby is born, providing between $1,000 and $3,000 in an account for every infant. And the amounts would vary based on family income, and it would be managed by the US Treasury until 18 years old.
Mhm.
So I loved that idea, but it still shows discrimination,
Yeah.
because basically, would the more wealthier or the more financially despaired receive more in the baby bonds? Why wouldn't it be an equal amount? And it goes back to the same thing we were just talking about with the schools,
Hmm.
right? Um, so how could this be afforded by government when the school funding is still disproportionate? I just, again, like it's a great idea. I just see some flaws that need to be ironed out. Um, and then there was another aspect in the chapter this one was a long chapter that I had a lot of notes on. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. You're fine.
Um, there was another aspect I wanted to point out. So they also provided the idea of Black-owned banks, basically having people in the community work in the bank so that they know and understand the community's needs and who's who. This actually reminded me of a documentary that we watched in another class, called Holding Ground, and it was about the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. Basically, how Dudley Street had become this really rundown, really despairing uh, environment and community, and they hired all these, bigwigs to come in and clean the community up. And when people were in on the initial meeting, they were like, "How do you know what we need? Do you live here?" You know? And they
Mhm.
were like, "Actually, we don't." So that's a really good point. And so instead, they held an election and they hired people from the community to head up this council to clean up the neighborhood, you
Mhm.
know? And I thought that that was a really, really good idea to have not just Black owned banks, but Latino owned banks, Asian American owned banks, whatever, but have minority owned banks and other programs so that they can better understand their community that they're serving. Um, okay, I have a few more notes on that chapter, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip that.
Okay.
All right. So chapter 5, ending the debt trap, strategies to stop the abuse of court-imposed fines and fees. So we they okay. So they talked about like smoking, tattoos, and manicures, etc., and how individuals that are on like trial or in a courtroom that have any of these indicators may actually it may lead to them being placed on supervision, such as probation, or even being jailed if they claim that they can't pay fees on the spot because the tattoos or the manicures or whatever show that they have money that they're just allocating to different resources, right? And I actually had a conversation with another peer about this not too long ago, and I thought it was really intriguing because he pointed out that basically, regardless of whether or not you're choosing to smoke or chew tobacco or get tattoos, like you are choosing where to allocate your money, and that can be a coping skill for you. So one
Mhm.
person may choose to go to the gym, the other person may choose cigarettes. And that's just their own form of coping with something, right? But regardless, who are you to tell me how I can and can't cope
Mhm.
with something?
Yeah.
So, I do understand this criminalization of poverty. I do understand it to an extent because my roommate is substantially behind on her rent, but she smokes marijuana.
Yep.
And so it's very frustrating. So, but luxuries such as those, maybe what's keeping that individual in a better mental health state, and I would rather see them in a healthier mental health state than in the hospital because they had a breakdown. Um, so it could be the thing. helping to keep them decompressed or afloat or whatever. So it could be a coffee for one person or a cigarette for the other. Um, but yeah, so on page 849, paragraph 1, it talks about how unpaid fees lead to parole violations, and then it makes them ineligible for public benefits, including food and housing assistance, which then also leads to new charges based on their debt. And that is the epitome of criminalization of poverty. And I think that's appalling, personally. So, my question here for this chapter is there still a way to hold people accountable for their debts and crimes without imposing further charges or imprisonments and still be able to get paid? And well, go ahead. I'll let you answer that.
I mean, I feel like, and I mean, it depends on the crime because there are some crimes that you can wait a little bit to get paid and to
Mhm.
have a fine, and there are some crimes that like you need to pay a fine now for what you just did, or like you need to pay bail if you want to get out of jail.
Yes.
But I feel like for some of the smaller crimes, asking and saying, look, okay, you don't have the money now. What do you need to be able to get that money? How long do you need? Could we give you a 2 week timeline? And if we don't have it in 2 weeks, a warrant's going out for your arrest and like a pickup order, because they still need to have accountability, but
Yeah.
someone genuinely may want to pay it back to have their conscience clear, but they don't have the money. Or they
Yeah.
need to go call around and call their friends to see who's willing to help them pay the money. And I would understand if they said they'd be able to get the money in a month and obviously did not try. If they tried and failed, eh. But if they obviously did not try, you can make their punishment harsher. Yeah, they promised something and didn't do it. But if they're clearly trying and they say, I need a month and then I need another week, but you can tell they obviously are doing it, I don't think we need to be throwing them in jail immediately because they're human and things happen. And one day your car breaks down and then you have $1,000
Mhm.
payment that you don't expect. And that's just life.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and I definitely agree. Like they need to be held accountable. And I think, there should be limitations for sure. If that person goes out and gets a new tattoo, even though that may be a coping skill for them, that's a
There's that.
$500 charge that they could have used towards paying off that debt, you know? I think there was another quote from the last chapter that I think applies here. People lack money, not the financial literacy to know how to use it, you
Yes.
know?
Hmm.
So, um, yeah. So, okay. So another question then too, or I guess maybe a suggestion to answer that last question is like, would monitoring certain incomes and necessities be a potential solution to this, such as restricting luxuries when until fines are paid, such as like only 10% of your um, income, I have no idea what that word says. But anyway, only 10% of your income might be used on luxuries until the fines are paid, such as Netflix, entertainment, stores, that kind of stuff. And like monitor those because if you look at like child support, they can monitor your income and then base your child support based on
Yeah.
how much income you have. So why wouldn't we be able to do the same thing with charges, fines, fees, all that stuff?
I think we should be able to. And I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know logistically how well that would work and how that would
Yeah.
work, just because that's a lot of moving pieces. But I think if a system was designed that was able to do that, 100% it should happen. And
Yes.
even to do less than 10% of you can still have, like,
Mhm.
if it, depending on the severity of the fine, like all money other than rent should go to it. And I
Yes.
think that would help teach, okay, you're not just at a get out of jail free card. Like we are literally like tinkering in your life until you figure this out. So figure it
Mhm.
out so we can stop tinkering in your life.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I do think you have a really good point in terms of the severity of the crime should
Hmm.
definitely indicate the amount of tinkering in your life.
Yes. Yeah. Like if you like get a speeding ticket or something and you can't pay your speeding ticket, that's one thing. But if you full on break into someone's house, don't do anything that gets you arrested, but like still have broken into someone's house. Actually, that might already get you arrested, but like you know what I'm saying. Like do something that's borderline arrest, not a good thing, like verbally assaulted someone, I don't know. That needs more retribution and like punishment than you getting a speeding ticket and not being able to pay it off right away. At least in my
Yes.
opinion.
Yes, I agree 100%. The severity of the crime should match the intensity of the interjection. Yes.
Definitely. Yes.
Okay, excellent. All right. So then moving on to chapter 6, Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights, a feminist approach for a new economy. So one of the quotes that stuck out to me was if domestic workers went on strike, almost every industry would be impacted. Doctors, lawyers, bankers, professors, small business owners, civil sector employees, and media executives. The urban economy would be paralyzed.
Mhm.
My question, this really focused on how females, especially, and women of color are still stuck in nannying and childcare and caregiving and all that. And like they put that ahead of their own family and their own lives sometimes, you
Mhm.
know, like one of the examples in the chapter was like of a woman getting up at like 4:30 in the morning to make breakfast and to get lunches prepared and all that stuff before she could even take care of her own family,
Yep.
you know? And so my question is like, how, after, like you mentioned, 40 plus years of feminism
Mhm.
and specifically feminist social work, have women and women of color not been able to break out of this role yet? And why are we still almost being condescended into this role at this point? Like, why are men too good to be in this role,
Mhm.
basically?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. And I think that's a hard one because there almost isn't an answer
Yes.
because it's so ingrained and embedded in society at this point. And
Yeah.
a lot of times, just the way it works in the hiring world, more men are being hired as CEOs and CFOs and those higher ranking, higher paying jobs, which leaves less room for equally, if not more qualified women. And while that is not directly the answer to your question, it partially is because that's where it starts. And then as you trickle down through the ranks of jobs, when you get to those lower paying jobs that require far more hours, far more mental capacity, or like mental stamina, all of those things, that's what a lot of women end up taking. I
Yes.
think you can also argue the biology piece and that women kind of are more innately wanting to help directly, but I think from the broader aspect, it's the fact that the society is still so geared towards men.
Yes. Yeah. Like you mentioned in your presentation aspect was just the fact that the patriarchy is still so
Hmm.
dominant.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Um, okay. So in the interest of time, I am going to stop with one more chapter. I'm not
Hmm.
going to get through chapters 8 and 9. But I really wanted to touch on chapter 7 because this is something very near and dear to my heart. So this was a revolution led by sex workers. And it talked about how prostitution, especially prostitution by trans Black people, should be allowed. And it talked about a lot of the benefits behind it. I am extremely passionate about abolishing the sex trade, specifically sex trafficking. And I get it that prostitution and sex trafficking are not exactly the same thing, but prostitution is often a cover up for what is actually happening in sex trafficking, right?
Hmm. Yep.
So I actually went through and I listed off a bunch of individual projects that are also working to abolish sex trafficking. So there's the Polaris Project, Project Exodus, Hookers for Jesus. Hookers for Jesus is really cool because they actually used to be hookers, and they call themselves that. So I feel comfortable using that word.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, but they used to be prostitutes that were then sucked into sex trafficking and were forced into sex labor and then were able to get out of the sex trade and now go out onto the streets to educate and offer faith-based programs to current prostitutes. So I love the program.
Yeah.
And then there's the Pink Room and my favorite, the A21 campaign. The A21 campaign is the biggest organization in the world that helps victims of sex trafficking. My question for this one was why was there absolutely no mention of sex trafficking throughout this entire chapter, specifically the overlap of that and the sex industry? And I know you can't answer that question because you're not the author, but it was really intriguing to me. And I am going to share my screen here for a second because I did come up with an article, or I found an article here. So, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the US Department of State, and this is an archived website. So this is actually from 2009. I'm sorry, 2004. So it is a little outdated, but things have not changed super drastically within the sex trade. So what I have highlighted here, the US government adopted a strong position against legalized prostitution based on evidence that it is inherently harmful and dehumanizing and fuels trafficking in persons, a form of modern day slavery. Prostitution and related activities, including pimping and patronizing or maintaining brothels, fuel the growth of modern day slavery by providing a facade behind which traffickers for sexual exploitation operate. Where it is legalized or tolerated, there's a greater demand for human trafficking victims, and there's always an increase in the number of women and children trafficked into this commercial sex slavery. And then these numbers are probably a little outdated, but of the people trafficked across international borders annually, 80% of victims are female, 50% are minors. Hundreds of thousands of these women and children are used in prostitution each year. So I found that really, really appalling, but really intriguing at the same time. And I was surprised that the chapter never touched on sex trafficking. So yeah.
My
All
guess is
right.
it was purposeful, but that's just
Maybe,
my
yes.
thought.
All right. Well, that is all I've got for you. I appreciate your engagement with my questions and letting me kind of just vent about my frustrations with some of these chapters.
I appreciate it. It was very good. I learned a lot, so thank you.
Of course. All right. Well, let me stop recording here.